The Amman message was a statement produced by various people in Jordan in 2004. And on the face of it, it was a definition of what was mainstream Islam. So on the face of it, it was a theological statement. But it didn't arise just out of an academic discussion. It was something that was produced in the specific circumstances of the period after 9/11, and actually especially after the Casablanca bombings in 2003. The most famous in the US is probably Hamza Yusuf, and in the UK there's Abdul Hakim Winter. But there are also but there's a sort of Anglophone network, which includes those two who I've just mentioned. Liberal and your position on the West are independent. I mean, there's the idea that they go together. That if you're liberal, you love America.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's possible to be liberal and not love America, or to love America and not be liberal.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the Markfield podcast. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our next guest, Professor Mark Sedgwick, who is Professor of Arab and Islamic Studies. Many of you will be familiar with his work. He has previously written on traditionalism, Sufism. His key works include things like Traditionalism, the Radical Project for Restoring Sacred Order, which we have with us today. On the Islamic side, he's written about Muhammad Abdu, on Sufism, on Islam and Muslims in the West. On the Western side, he's written things about the radical right, key thinkers, anarchism, Sufism, and the making of European Muslims. So I'm really, really pleased to be able to introduce Professor Mark Sedgwick.
Great to be here.
So, Professor, what is traditionalism?
The traditionalism that I've been working with for some time, and also which I'm writing about in this most recent book, is a sort of philosophy which takes forms, it takes religious forms, and it also takes political forms. And the forms which are probably most important nowadays are actually the political forms, which is a development from when I was first working on it, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, when it was the religious forms that were most interesting. And the religious forms tend to be Islamic. Not always, but they tend to be Islamic.
Okay, so, I mean, if you were going to define Islamic traditionalism, which is one part of this broader traditionalist movement, how would you, I mean, is there a term that we could use in Arabic for traditionalism?
Well, I mean, the term I'd use is, for this sort of traditionalism, there are really at least two different sorts of traditionalism in Islam. One of them is this sort of traditionalism, which I would call Guénonian traditionalism, in order to distinguish it from the other forms. The people who are part of this stream of thought just describe themselves as traditionalists, but because they all come in some way or another from the thought of this French philosopher René Guénon, who became Muslim, or as he put it, moved into Islam, and is therefore also known as Abdul Wahid Yahya. So the form of traditionalism which draws very heavily on his work, I would call Guénonian traditionalism. But there are also other traditionalist movements within Islam today which don't draw to the same extent on Guénon's work, and which I would call neo-traditionalism. And there are some other scholars who are also interested in them and who also use this term neo-traditionalism. And the reason that we tend to say neo-traditionalism, even though they just refer to themselves as traditionalists, is that there is a sort of there's a possible concept of the traditional that existed in the past, and whether one locates the traditional in 1800 or 1600 or is not completely obvious. But the point is that it's in the past and it's before modernity. And that's important because a lot of people tend to put tradition and modernity in opposition to each other, which means that the way you're understanding tradition becomes a function of how you understand modernity. Fine. So we've got people who were sort of genuinely traditional because they lived before modernity in the 16th century or whatever. And we have people today who are objecting to certain aspects of modernity and are emphasizing that they are traditional rather than being something else, rather than being modern. And that's why we say neo-traditional to distinguish these people today from people who lived in the 16th century or whatever.
So just to clarify, neo-traditionalism is, in essence, a rejection of modernity and an attempt to maybe reclaim or hark back to a past prior to modernity.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So you mentioned this figure and you said he's quite central to Islamic traditionalism, René Guénon.
Yeah.
He also goes by the name of Abdul Wahid Yahya. Can you say a little bit more about him?
Well, he was a Frenchman, and he was one of a generation of French intellectuals who rejected Catholicism and were interested in non-Western forms of religion. And in fact, originally, he was more interested in Hinduism than anything else. But then he became interested in Islam and interested especially in Sufism. And he understood Sufism as being a survival, one of the few survivals in the modern world, of what he called the perennial tradition, the primordial tradition. So his idea was that right from the beginning of humanity, there had been a religious truth, we might call it, which survived in Islam, in Sufism, and had been lost, he thought, to the Christians, and possibly, he thought, also survived in the Vedanta, in the Hindu tradition. But what he wrote about mostly was the Hindu tradition and this idea of the primordial tradition. But he moved to Cairo and he lived the last 20 years or so of his life in Cairo as a Sufi and a Muslim.
So, in terms of his centrality to this movement, who does he influence? Why is his name relevant today?
Yes. Okay. So he influenced quite a lot of people, but the most important one was a Swiss man called Fridtjof Schorn, who became Sheikh Nuruddin. And Schorn put together a global network of people who were interested in traditional religion, in Sufism, most of whom became Muslim and Sufis, and they were all fairly high quality intellectuals, and they wrote, they gave lectures, they arranged exhibitions, they did all sorts of things, and were therefore influential on the development of Islam, especially in the West. And in England, the best known was Martin Lings, who died some years ago, but who was of course also Muslim and also Sufi, and who in the 1970s, 1980s was probably one of the leading spokespersons for Islam in Britain. And then in the United States, there was Syed Hossein Nasr, still is Syed Hossein Nasr. He's getting on in years, but he's still around and he's still working. And he was, again, in the US, one of the main spokespeople for Islam, wrote books that were very influential, been translated into a lot of languages as well, especially into Turkish and into Bosnian.
Yeah, I mean, many people will be familiar with the work of Nasser.
Yeah.
So would you say both of these two scholars that you've mentioned were influenced by Gwenon to large extents in terms of their philosophy and the way they looked at things?
Yes, I mean, if you look at Ling's at the beginning, he was very close to Geno. He lived in Cairo whilst Geno was living in Cairo, and he was in effect Geno's secretary for many years. So his understanding was very close to that of Geno. Also of Schuon, he followed Schuon as his own sheikh, in fact, and as did Nasser. So their understandings are following very much in that tradition, one could say.
So just as a final question on that, would it be fair to describe them, and I don't know if this would be slightly controversial, but would it be fair to describe them as perennialists?
Indeed, no, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, if you read Schuon's most important book, for example, on the transcendent unity of religions, is very, very clearly perennialist. And for some people, this has been a source of controversy because the extent to which perennialism is compatible with mainstream Islamic understandings has certainly been brought into question. And I think myself that it depends slightly how one is understanding perennialism, because I mean, in Islam, the religion of Sayyidina Adam was the original religion of humanity. So the idea that there is an original religion is completely Islamic. The question then becomes about the relationship between Islam, after the revelation of Islam, between Islam and other religions. So I think most Muslims would agree with Guénon that Roman Catholicism is a very appropriate path to follow. But Schuon's understanding, because he looked especially at religions. So as far as Schuon is concerned, Roman Catholicism contains truth, Islam contains truth, Buddhism contains truth, they all contain truth. And that is where we begin to get into difficulties from the perspective of Islamic theology.
Sure. Okay. So this is one aspect of traditionalism,
Exactly.
the Gwenon tradition.
Yeah, exactly.
But there are other trends within the traditionalist or neo-traditionalist movement.
Yeah, and this gets a bit complicated, and I think it's important to distinguish them, because although the other trends that we're probably going to talk about now in some ways belong together with this Guénonian traditionalism, they are not perennialist, or certainly not explicitly perennialist. And they don't refer to Guénon in the same way that the Guénonian traditionalists. I mean, I'm sure they've all read Guénon. They certainly know who he is. They know what his thought is, and they've probably read him. But he's not a sort of standard point of reference in the way that he is for the Guénonian traditionalists.
So could you speak a little bit more about some of these other trends? Perhaps give a few examples.
Yes. Well, what I and others call neo-traditionalism. There are a couple of very prominent figures in the US and in the UK as well. The most famous in the US is probably Hamza Yusuf, and in the UK there's Abdul Hakim Winter. But there are also but there's a sort of Anglophone network, which includes those two who I've just mentioned. Then there's a Francophone network, which purely for linguistic reasons is somewhat separate, which we find in North Africa, France, Italy. And then there are people with fairly similar views who we find in the Arab world. So that's three neo-traditionalist networks, and the one that one finds in the Arab world, which is represented, for example, by Prince Ghazi in Jordan, that overlaps with the network, the Anglophone network, not only in terms of beliefs, but they know each other. They cooperate. They work together. They recognize each other as allies. Whereas the French network tends to stay fairly much on its own, although the ideas are very similar. To some extent, there are references to Guénon also in the French network. But for purely linguistic reasons, as I say, they remain quite separate.
So, what are some of the characteristics that you find with the neo-traditionalists?
The thing that makes them neo-traditionalists is their reference to tradition, their insistence on tradition, and their opposition to modernity. That they tend to place tradition in opposition to modernity, and things which are associated with modernity are bad, and this means both T-shirts with messages written on them and the Muslim Brothers.
So yeah, I mean, this was my next question. In terms of, for example, I mean, many from, say, the Salafi movement would also consider themselves to be traditional in a particular way, but
Yes.
I get the feeling that this school of neo-traditionalism wouldn't necessarily view the Salafi movement as part of their movement.
Absolutely not, because how tradition is understood varies importantly between those two groups. For the Salafis, obviously, the only thing that really, the tradition that has authority is the Hadith, and obviously the Quran as well. But for the neo-traditionalists, it is the madhabs. So in a sense, you could say it's the ijma that has authority. And whilst for the Salafis, it's extremely important to look at the source, to look at the hadith carefully, freshly, and question its authority and so forth. For the neo-traditionalists, absolutely one does not want to be doing that, because the authority of the hadith and so forth is understood to have been worked out many, many centuries ago, and the point of reference is the tradition of the madhab, which includes the tradition of the hadith. But as far as the neo-traditionalists are concerned, if you start looking directly at the hadith in the way that the Salafis do, you are throwing away the ijma, you're throwing away 1,000 years of scholarship.
So, I mean, part of that then is the taqlid to a madhab.
Absolutely.
But that's in a legal sense. Is there also a theological position or characteristic that, I mean, a theological persuasion, let's say, that's promoted?
Yeah, yes. I mean, they tend to refer also to the Ash'ari Aqidah. And then the third thing that they all put together with this is Sufism.
Sufism is a broad term. Is there particular types of Sufism? It's particular tariqas?
Yes, I mean they don't sort of publicly prefer one tariqa over another, but in practice they all tend to go with various branches of the Shazali tariqa. Now, you know, Sufism is pretty broad, as you say. Shazali tariqa is pretty broad today. There was, in fact, a Shazali-derived tariqa, which was extremely important for the Guénonian traditionalists, and this was a branch of the Alawiya, of the Algerian Alawiya in origin, and then Shuan reconstituted it as an independent tariqah, which he called the Mariamiyya, after Sayyidina Maryam. And this was because of some visions in which he saw Sayyidina Maryam. And this brings us into another area of controversy. But for the neo-traditionalists, they're not interested in the Mariamiyya at all, and they tend to follow one or another branch of the Shaziliya.
So, Mike, what was the Amman message, and what's its link to neo-traditionalism?
So the Amman message was a statement produced by various people in Jordan in 2004. And on the face of it, it was a definition of what was mainstream Islam. So on the face of it, it was a theological statement. But it didn't arise just out of an academic discussion. It was something that was produced in the specific circumstances of the period after 9/11, and actually especially after the Casablanca bombings in 2003, which showed people in the Muslim world, if they didn't realize this already, that it wasn't just an American problem, that it was everybody's problem. So. It was an attempt, as I say, to define, identify mainstream Islam, perhaps what we would call moderate Islam, in quotation marks, because it's a term that always has to be used in quotation marks, because I don't know what it is, and I don't know whether you know what it is. But so it was a normative statement that was meant to exclude certain positions which were associated with problematic political positions and with terrorism.
What happens to the Salafis in
this? Well, I mean, the true Salafis, are obviously people who don't who accept taqlid to the madhabs.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that most Salafis don't accept taqlid to the madhabs, these true Salafis clearly aren't the same as most Salafis.
And that's not even to get into the theological controversies with the Ash'ari, with the Ash'aris.
This is, yes. But anyhow, to go back to the question about the relationship between that and the reactions to 9/11. The neo-traditionalist positions are there before 9/11. Hamza Yusuf is there before 9/11. Abdul Hakim Winter, they're all there before 9/11. But in the West, they become super relevant after 9/11 because this is an understanding of Islam which can be put in opposition to Al-Qaeda and all these things. They also become of great importance in the Arab world after 9/11, after the Casablanca bombings, because this is an understanding of Islam which can be put in opposition to Al-Qaeda, to certain understandings of Salafism, and even to the Muslim Brothers, who, of course, had nothing much to do with Al-Qaeda. But if you're an Arab state, you have issues probably with the Muslim Brothers in terms of the competition for power.
And is the Jordanian state involved in this? I mean, we mentioned Prince Ghazi.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it was involved because Prince Ghazi was instrumental in the drafting of this message, because the institution that he heads, the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Studies, is a state institution, and also because the Amman message was meant to represent a consensus. So it wasn't just the views of a few people sitting in Amman, because after it had been produced, other people were asked to sign it. And virtually every mufti of every country you can imagine has by now signed it, along with an awful lot of other people. And this was not just because they were convinced of its theological correctness. It was because it was promoted by the Jordanian state, and the mufti is, after all, both an alim and an official. It's a state position in most countries. So it was theological, and it was also a state-sponsored initiative.
Okay. Building on that conversation regarding neo-traditionalism, then we've had some case studies and looking at neo-traditionalism in the contemporary world. We've spoken about Martin Lings. We've spoken about, you mentioned Hamza Yusuf, who's very key.
He is talking about the authority of the tradition, which means the authority of tradition, of transmission, and he himself has that authority because he's a recipient of that transmission.
And do you think Mauritania is, the description of Mauritania is of this very traditional society?
Yes.
I think you previously gave the example of, people imagine sitting on a mountain in Yemen somewhere. Is Mauritania that type of society, would you say?
Well, I'm not an expert on Mauritania, and I'm not an expert on Yemen either. But I mean, when the last time I was in Yemen, it did seem further away from an awful lot of modern currents than many places. But I don't think either Yemen or Mauritania, in fact, I don't think anywhere on this planet is any longer completely isolated from modernity. And since the invention of the mobile phone, I think that's the last straw on the camel's back.
Gwenon would probably be upset, but. But yeah, no, just on that point, I'm pretty sure I've seen lectures live streamed from Mauritanian tents now. So
yes,
technology's everywhere.
So there we go. Of course, Guénon would object that the whole issue of tradition and modernity is rather more fundamental than the recording technology that's being used. And in fact, this is an important point that some people think that a traditionalist has got to be fully traditional and may not speak into a microphone. Guénon didn't speak into microphones, but he did print his books. And his point wasn't that there's a problem with a microphone or a printing press. His problem was, the problem he points out with the printing press is not the printing press, but what it tended to print. And his point was the value of tradition and the absence of that tradition in modernity. So the problem with modernity isn't so much what it contains, microphones, as what it lacks, which is the tradition. He also, and this is a point where the neo-traditionalists don't necessarily follow, he also did object to certain things that modernity contained, not microphones, but the idea of equality, the idea of democracy, the idea of individualism, and ideas like that, but not the microphone or the printing press.
Is that also why perhaps you see those similar tendencies with perhaps, I don't know if the right word would be radical right-wing movements?
Yes, absolutely. Some of the radical right-wing movements, or not so much some of the thinkers in these movements, right? Yeah. Because the average member of the movement, we don't really know what they're reading, if anything. But the leaders of many of these movements do, in fact, refer to, and take inspiration from this sort of traditionalism, which produces the apparent oddity of people who are publicly very Islamophobic, calling for the repatriation of Muslims and things like that, who are actually reading and being inspired by the work of a European who became Muslim, which is quite an irony in some ways.
Yeah, it's
But
also quite interesting because you do see. There's been instances of this people who have been quite Islamophobic, very very conservative, who end up becoming Muslims as a result. Yeah,
so,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, the logical consequence of that. I mean, because the opposition to modernity you can place several things in opposition to modernity, right? I mean, a lot of the political guys want a tradition which they can place in opposition to modernity, which is somehow authentically European, and they don't want Christianity. So quite a lot of them end up with neo-paganism, but neo-paganism isn't exactly a living tradition in the way that Islam is. Yeah.
yeah. No, I mean it makes a lot of sense in terms of just the kind of network of ideas, if you will, or thinkers, and the way the ideas spread. But on that point, then, because of course, neo-traditionalism is not the only trend in terms of Islam's conversation with modernity. We see a number of different trends. And maybe you can speak to that a little. What else do we see? So neo-traditionalism,
Yeah.
just to kind of re-emphasize the point here, I mean, people are perhaps familiar with modernism, which is a case of where Muslim thinkers are happily imbibing quote-unquote modern ideas. And you've written a book on Muhammad Abdu
Yeah.
as an example of that.
Yeah.
So what different types of trends do we see in response to modernity? And maybe you can just, what was there before modernity?
Yes,
Yeah.
quite. Well, I mean, what was there before modernity? If it depends on how we define it, doesn't it? Because if we define tradition and modernity as opposing pairs, then by definition, what was there before modernity was tradition, which is slightly problematic because, of course, there was more than one sort of tradition. Islam was revealed against tradition, right? I mean, there were certain traditions that were the Islamic revelation was trying to stop and did stop. But if one takes this binary pair, if one ignores the problem that there are various different sorts of tradition, then what was there? We can call it traditional. In Mauritania or in Istanbul. Quite when Istanbul was first exposed to modernity is a very difficult question. But shall we say, perhaps Istanbul at the time of the conquest of Constantinople, that was traditional without much modernity around. Anyhow, the first reaction to modernity is traditional people who grew up without modernity and without modern ideas, and when they first see them, are not impressed. And that is the position of the Egyptian ulama when Napoleon turns up, for example. But then the next, and that we can call the genuinely traditional reaction, right? And then the next reaction that one gets chronologically is indeed people like Muhammad Abdu, and is people who like some of these ideas of modernity and who reinterpret Islam to make it compatible with some of these ideas that they like. And that's still around. I mean, arguably it's more present in North America than anywhere else at present, but that progressive modernism is still around. And then the next thing we get is the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore what one might call Ikhwani interpretations and understandings, which are modern, which are addressing modern issues. And issues produced by modernity, that is, but are absolutely not progressivist in the way that Abdul was, because rather than trying to reinterpret Islam to endorse certain positions, they are tending to produce an alternative to those positions. And then we get the Salafis turning up, they were around before. That position was around long before this, but it was a pretty much minority position. Whereas in recent decades, Salafi understandings have become more and more popular. And then I think we end up with the neo-traditionalists, who are a reaction to modernity, but they're also a reaction to Salafism and a reaction to Ikhwani positions and a reaction to the original modernist progressivist positions.
No, they're certainly all in conversation. I take the point. So, for example, I mean, if we take something like you mentioned Muslim Brotherhood or Ikhwan, someone like Hassan al-Banna. I mean, there's a link between Hassan al-Banna, Rashid Rida, going back to Abdu. And so these things, I mean, it could be argued that perhaps, you know, it's a little bit of a strange conceptualization sometimes, but because of the breakaway from taqlid, let's say,
Yes.
the emphasis on ijtihad,
Yes.
which is something that they all potentially share in common. It perhaps, as you said, pits them against those that are trying to preserve the importance and significance of the madhabs, as an example. Although, albeit, Abdu's writing in the heyday of colonialism and is quite impressed by European nations when he travels to France, for example. Whereas by the time we get to someone like Rashid Rida, it's far more critical. And then by the time we get to Hassan al-Banna, again, it's moved in a different direction, but still the same breakaway from the madhab position.
Yes, because the difference between Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdul is very much a difference of their own personal experience, of their own political experience. And of course, what we have to remember with Abdul is that he started off as a rebel. He started off as a constitutionalist, and he spent some time in a very anti-British position before.
He's exiled, isn't he?
He was. He was sitting in Paris, publishing a short-lived and rather small newspaper, but a very influential one, where he develops the idea that jihad against colonialism is fard ain. This being a position that is normally associated with Al-Qaeda. I mean, if you take if you take a group of reasonably well-informed people and ask who developed the idea of jihad against the West as fard ain, you'll probably get the answer Osama bin Laden, but it wasn't. It was Muhammad Abdul.
And by the way, this is also why the neo-traditionalists would argue, from their perspective, that going back and reinterpreting the tradition anew can lead to, I mean, it can solve problems, but it can also open up that kind of worms potentially. But I mean, it's interesting because Abdu's often presented as a kind of liberal reformer, and to a certain extent, of course he was. In the end, yeah. But he goes on his own journey.
He does indeed.
At that point, he's calling for a restoration of the caliphate, and it's a young Abdu, let's say, it's a rebel Abdu.
And of course, I mean, the liberal and your position on the West are independent. I mean, there's the idea that they go together. That if you're liberal, you love America. But I mean, it's possible to be liberal and not love America, or to love America and not be liberal.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so you've outlined a number of different kind of streams of thinking there. Would it be fair then to say that neo-traditionalism is very much a product of modernity as a reaction against it? If modernism is an acceptance of those values and a promotion of at least some of those values, then neo-traditionalism is perhaps a rejection of modernity, but also a construction of modernity.
Indeed, because it's a product of modernity, and something which is a product of modernity is by definition modern. I mean, there's also the idea of the dialectic, where you have one position giving rise to an opposite position, and so forth and so on. So, if we take certain Ikhwani positions as a reaction against Abdu's Western enthusiasms, which, however, include something of Abdu's possessions in the emphasis on a new ijtihad. So we can see how each position is a reaction against the earlier position, which takes with it, which has in itself something of that earlier position. So, for as far as the neo-traditionalists are concerned, they are a comment on social problems as well as what they see as the problems specifically of modern society, but also of modern Muslim society.
Okay, so on that point, then, let's turn to the question, because you've already mentioned the political link with some of the proponents of neo-traditionalism.
Yes.
So what are some of the political issues? Because, I mean, it seems to me that there's two different conversations taking place. One is neo-traditionalism in the West. You mentioned certain figures like Hamza Yusuf, and on the other side, we have neo-traditionalism in the Muslim world, perhaps specifically the Arab world we've mentioned. I mean, are they speaking to the same context? Are they speaking to the same concerns? What are the maybe restrictions isn't the right word, but what are the underlying issues that lead them to say the things that they're saying? If that makes sense.
Yes, I mean the two contexts are very different, and saying the same thing in two different contexts can actually mean different things. Because in an Arab in the context of the Muslim world, especially in an Arab context, emphasizing taqlid is very close to emphasizing loyalty to the ulama who are loyal to the regime. And opposing them is the opposition in the Arab world is very often somehow connected with the Ikhwan or Salafism or something like that. So condemning the Ikhwan and Salafism and all that in a Muslim country, you are in effect condemning the opposition to the regime. So once again, directly and indirectly, in the Arab world, neo-traditional Islam is very close to being an endorsement of the regime, which incidentally is why many Arab regimes are quite pleased about the neo-traditionalist current and support it. Whereas in the West, where we have non-Muslim regimes, endorsing taqlid doesn't mean endorsing Rishi Sunak. So it's
one would hope not.
So it's so the political significance of saying that I simply to say I understand Islam in terms of taqlid to the madhab, which is an abstract theological statement. In an Arab context, it is close to being a declaration of support for the regime, which in the West it is not.
Could you say potentially, I mean, I'm just thinking about this in the context of the war on terror, that there is some overlap in that in regard to, even in Western nations, trying to quote unquote moderate?
Well, quite. Yeah, this is the point, isn't it? Because I mean, Muslim Arab countries typically the ulama state employees, etc., etc. And in the Western context, the ulama are not state employees at all. But since 9/11, since the war on terror, Western governments have all been extremely enthusiastic about supporting moderate Islam. Now, the problem is nobody really knows what moderate Islam is.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. Final question, and perhaps a little bit more of a personal question. What drew you to this area of study? I mean, was it originally studying European traditionalism, and that led to the study of Islamic traditionalism, or was it the other way around?
Yeah.
Firstly,
No, it was quite personal actually. When I was living in Cairo, I met some people who were Ghanaian traditionalists. I didn't know what Ghanaian traditionalism was. They were quite nice people. But there were certain questions that were raised. And initially, it was a sort of personal attempt to try and work out what on earth was going on. Um, but this developed into a scholarly study of Ghanaian traditionalism, and then the study of Ghanaian traditionalism led to a study of traditionalism as a whole, and therefore the neo-traditionalism, and the question of what is modernity, what is tradition, where do we all go from here? Where do I personally go? That also contributed to the research.
So to wrap up then the podcast, let me ask you one final question. Really finishing off where we started, and that is the question of how traditional is traditionalism?
Clearly, it's modern, but does modernity and tradition have to be a binary relationship? Perhaps there's a synthesis. Perhaps there has never been one single tradition. And perhaps throughout history, tradition and modernity have been in conversation with each other, in which case perhaps this modern neo-traditionalism is actually quite traditional.